Okay, so this slideshow is going to be an introduction to unseen poetry. And what it's going to discuss is how to best approach the unseen poetry question. Now, unseen poetry challenges you to react to a poem that is not on your course. You are expected to be able to understand the main themes the poem explores and identify and analyze some of the poem's key features. Now, it is important to remember that you are unlikely to have seen the unseen poem that appears on your paper before. However, what you need to remember is that by the time you sit your exam, you will have studied about 30 poems since 5th year. You'll have done 12 with me, and you have studied about 18 with Mr. Clark. And this is not to mention all the poems you will have encountered in junior cycle. And this is fantastic preparation for the unseen poem. The poetry section is challenging. However, you need to have the confidence to believe in your own interpretation of the poem. In addition, you need to have the confidence in your writing skills to shape your response into an interesting, thoughtful, and insightful answer. Now, it is worth bearing in mind that the unseen poem is worth 5% of your English exam. That could easily mean the difference between a H1 or a H2. I would leave the unseen poem until last, and I would spend about 20 minutes on it. Read the poem 3 times at least before attempting any question. It can also be helpful to read the questions after the first reading, as they can set you on the right path or show you where you should focus your answer. It's also worth pointing out that this section is also not often answered by students, which is a loss of over 20 marks. Now, omitting questions or part of questions can have a detrimental effect on your grade and on the examiner's overall impression of your script. Now, this question is generally presented in 2 parts. You have a choice between part A, which will be broken into 2 10-mark questions, or a part B, which is 20-mark question. Obviously, 10 marks, 2 paragraphs, 20 marks is 4 paragraphs. Because you only have 20 minutes to answer this question, this means you do not need to analyze the poem in the in-depth way you would analyze your studied poems. You simply need to give your impression of the poem, your personal response, and point out any literary devices that have been used and what effect do they have on you, the reader. Now, in your first reading of the poem, aim to get an initial sense of what the poet is writing about, and think about why the poet is writing about that particular subject. What is happening? Who is involved? Is there a sense of place and atmosphere? Avoid wasting time worrying about any words that you don't understand. Instead, focus on what makes sense to you. Where it is included, and if it is included, read the brief introduction to the poem. Sometimes the introduction explains the context of the poem or the background to the poem. This can help you to understand the general gist of a poem. Think about the poem's title. A title usually points towards a crucial idea or a key moment in a poem. After the first reading, study the questions. Select a question or questions that you are going to answer. Then read the poem again, more slowly, a second and even a third time, keeping the exact terms of the question or questions in focus. When you are reading the poem, do not read it as if you are reading a newspaper article. You must read each word carefully, looking out for patterns in the use of words, imagery, and sounds. After you have read the poem a second time, at this point you should begin to understand more about the poet's choice of title. Does it point to a key concern or issue in the poem? Where is this issue particularly evident in the poem? Ask yourself these questions. Does the title tell you anything about the theme of the poem? Does it set up any expectations which are perhaps fulfilled or shattered as you read on? The title of the poem is very important, and the poet spent quite some time choosing it, so don't ignore it. When you are reading the poem for a third time, I would recommend that you jot down your response to the poem on the side. This is your PR, your personal response. Now, these notes may take the form of words or phrases from the poem that you feel are important. It might also help you to write questions teasing out the literal meaning of a word or a phrase. Or else, write a note or a commentary as you go, expressing your understanding of the poem. Record your feelings, record your resistance to the poem, anything you do not agree with, or else write down what you do approve of. This can incorporate any aspect of the poem, such as statements, choice of words, the imagery, the tone, or the values maybe that the poem expresses. It might also be helpful to note other poems that this poem reminds you of. In this way, you can create a territory in which the poem can be understood and read. Do not feel that you have to supply all of the answers asked of you by a poem. You need to trust in your own interpretation of the poem. When you're reading the poem the third time, it's really important that you analyze or interrogate the poem as best you can. Now, there are many ways to analyze a poem. And the first thing that I would look at is the actual words of the poem. Remember that every word chosen by the poet suggests that another word was rejected. Often, there are one or two words in a poem that carry a weight of meaning. That means that there's one or two words in the poem that can explain what the poem is about. These words can be read in a variety of ways and can sometimes open up the poem for you. So, these words, you need to ask yourself, are the words in the poem used simple or complex? That means, are the words easy to understand? Are they difficult? Then, the ideas, or the concept that's formed from these words? Are these ideas concrete or abstract? That means the words that are used in the poem, do they have one meaning or multiple meanings? If they have multiple meanings, therefore could be considered abstract. Next, you need to look at the patterns of word usage. For example, words that refer to maybe colours or verbs. Now, what do these colours or verbs suggest? Do they have a positive or a negative effect on the poem? You also need to look at if there's any keywords that carry a symbolic meaning. Now, these words, is there any contrasts in them or contradictions? For example, night and day, winter and summer, joy and sorrow, love and death. Now, after looking at the words of the poem, the next thing I would focus on is the tone. Now, the tone is the feeling and attitude of the poet towards the subject of the poem. Think of the tone of voice the poet would use if reading this poem aloud. So you need to ask yourself, would the tone change as the poem progresses? Now, that is, would some parts maybe perhaps be read in a loud voice? Would other parts be read in an excited voice? And would some parts be read maybe in a quieter voice? The tone can change several times throughout the poem. If you notice changes as you were reading, then jot them down next to the poem on your page. Now, rhythm is also incredibly important. Now, what is rhythm? Rhythm is essentially the pace of the poem, and you need to ask yourself, is it fast or is it slow? You also need to ask yourself, does the rhythm tell us anything about the theme or the tone of the poem? For example, a slow rhythm is often associated with sadness. You need to ask yourself, what effect does this rhythm have? Does the rhythm vary? And if so, why? For example, poems can have exciting moments in between calm and reflective ones. You need to see if there is punctuation in the poem. Is there a full stop at the end of a line? If there is, that can slow down the rhythm of the poem. If there isn't any punctuation, are the lines run on? That means, do you go from line 2 to line 3 with no punctuation? If there is no punctuation, that can speed up the rhythm of the poem. A full stop at the end of the poem can also suggest closure and can tell us that the poet has come to some sort of understanding or resolution about the issue or the theme that was raised in the poem. Now, the next thing that I would focus on is if there's a rhyming scheme. So you need to ask yourself, is there a rhyming scheme? If so, what effect does it have on the poem? For example, a poem written using rhyming couplets has a definite rhythm, and single ideas are often contained within a couplet. That is, one issue that would be part of broader issues within the poem. A poet may also use a rhyming couplet at the end of the poem in order to focus our attention on the main message of the poem, or to make specific lines in the poem stand out. Of course, not every poem has a rhyming scheme. If there is no rhyming scheme, ask yourself why not.